Good morning, everyone. I'm Karin McElfish. I'm a member of the board for Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. I am a member of Mount Olivet United Methodist Church here in Arlington, Virginia, and I live on Algonquin land. And this morning, I'm going to start us in prayer. Let's join in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity to join together, to learn together, to be in conversation together. We come before you knowing we have much to learn and pray for open ears and open hearts. Help us to be able to hear truths which may be uncomfortable, to acknowledge and repent of past and present wrongs, including those perpetrated by our governments and our faith communities, to build relationships between each other, and to do the work needed for healing. May our time here together today guide us to focus on racial equity and Native justice, that all may live life to its fullest. These things we pray in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Aisha Huertas. I am the BFCPP board member and chair of the board's Racial Equity Committee. I'm also the outgoing Minister of Informational Engagement for the Episcopal Diocese of Virginia. And I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the land of the Powhatan people. The board and staff of BICPP have been working over the last 2 years to educate ourselves, equip our leaders, and live into our mission of racial equity advocacy. We know that we live in a moment when some don't want to talk about racial equity, but we are people of faith. We believe in telling the truth in love, but still the truth. White supremacy and racism is deep in Virginia's history and structure. Lots of work for all of us. This morning, we have 2 fabulous speakers to help us learn more about racial and health equity. The first speaker is Mark Charles, a speaker, writer, and consultant who recently moved to Washington, D.C. from the Navajo Reservation. The son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man, Mark seeks to understand the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and faith in order to help forge a path of healing and reconciliation for the nation. He partners with numerous organizations to assist them in respectfully approaching, including and working with Native communities. Mark serves as the Washington, D.C. correspondent and regular columnist for Native News Online, and is the author of the popular blog Reflections from the Hogan. Mark also serves on the board of the Christian Community Development Association and consults with the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. He is a founding partner of a national conference for Native students called Would Jesus Eat Fry Bread? Mark is also the founder and director of 5 Small Loaves, an organization that pursues racial conciliation through honest education, intentional conversation, and meaningful action. Under this organization, he has proposed the development of a truth commission to shed light on the injustices perpetrated against Native Americans, first rooted in the doctrine of discovery. Today, he will delve into the historic impact of the doctrine, its contemporary implications, and the responsibility of the church. Welcome, Mark.
Yat-e, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. And I want to say good morning to the entire Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. It is an honor to be with you today. Please allow me to introduce myself. So Yat-e, Mark Charles Yunishya, Tsin Beke Dina Nishle, Dotohiglini Bashichin, Tsin Beke Dina Dashachelo Toluchini Dashanella. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identity comes from our mother's mother. Now, my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Tsin Beke Dine. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Beke Dine. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toluchitni. That's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from what's now known as Washington, D.C., but these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. The Piscataway, they're the nation that they were living here, hunting here, farming here, fishing here, raising their families here, and burying their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. and they are still here. I want to acknowledge that the Piscataway are the host people of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just publicly state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. If you are interested in understanding and knowing and learning about whose lands you are living on, there's a great resource. It's a website I use frequently whenever I travel to find out whose lands I'm on. And it's a website called native-land.ca. I just put it into the chat, and you can use that. You can enter your city, your state, your zip code, and find out the history of those lands regarding indigenous peoples, what treaties were signed there, what languages were spoken there, and what people are indigenous to those lands. I have about 20 minutes to speak with you today about the doctrine of discovery. Now, I need to warn you, over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to say some things that are going to be fairly shocking. I'm going to teach you some history that most likely you've never heard of before. And if I do my job well, I will end up offending almost everybody listening to this live stream. One of the things that I am working hard to do is to lay out the truths that our nation was founded upon, and to help us understand the challenges we face moving forward, especially when we look at our nation's problems through a political lens. We tend to want to blame the challenges we face as a nation on the opposing party. If that leader hadn't done those things, if that party hadn't done those things, if this party was just in control, or if that leader had just been elected, things would be so much better. But I want to help you understand today how the challenges we face as a nation are not because of one party or the other party. It's because of the values that we were founded on, the implicit and explicit biases that we have been given, and the things that we've never learned to confront as a nation. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'll walk you through what the doctrine of discovery is, and I'm going to try to highlight 3 ways that A, it's been embedded into our foundations, and B, the way it's really shaped our political discourse and created challenges for us, not only as Americans, but also as people of faith. So give me just a moment to share my screen, and we'll be able to get going here. Okay. Once again, I want to acknowledge I'm on the lands of the Piscataway. So invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit. These are the words of Pope Nicholas V in a papal bull written in 1452. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, are collectively known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. So this is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people because they did not believe them to be human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claim to have discovered it. The first chapter of the book, On Selling Truth, that I co-authored begins with the statement, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can colonize those lands. You cannot discover them unless your implicit racial bias informs you that the people already there are not fully human. So the doctrine of discovery is a white Christian supremacist doctrine. Now, the challenge with this doctrine is the way it's been embedded into the foundations of our nation. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he said to the colonies that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset those colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land, and they went on to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason the founding fathers used that inclusive term all men is because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. So this makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document. Now, a few years later, the founders signed another document. This one began with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, if you read not even much further, just a few lines further down to Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 is the section of the Constitution that defines who is and who is not included in this union and who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you have to know is it never mentions women. This is important because if you read the entire Constitution, preamble all the way down to the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns, 51 he, him, and his, who can run for office, who can hold office, even who's protected by this document. There is not a single female pronoun in the entire Constitution. So we have to know Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, in 1787, that literally left white men. And technically, it was white landowning men who could vote. See, we don't think about this frequently enough. The purpose of our Constitution, the intent of our founders, was to protect the interest of white landowning men. So we act shocked today that women earn 60 to 70 cents to the dollar. Well, this isn't shocking. The Constitution's working. We act outraged that our prisons are filled with people of color. This actually isn't surprising. The Constitution's working. People get upset that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United, ruled that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opened the door for super PACs and their unlimited support of candidates. But this is not surprising. The Constitution is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's protecting the interests of white landowning men. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, Mr. Charles, we corrected those things. Well, we tried. Right? In 1865, we passed the 13th Amendment. Most people believe the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. They think it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. That's actually not what it says. What it actually says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. The 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. So it's not surprising that the United States of America has the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. And we incarcerate our people of color at 3 to 5 times the rate that we incarcerate white people. So we just have to acknowledge, to this day, slavery is not abolished. It is completely legal under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. This makes the Constitution of the United States a systemically white supremacist and sexist document. Now, how does this play out in our politics? Well, let's think back just a few years ago, right? In May of 2020, the world watched as George Floyd was lynched publicly in Minnesota. He was choked publicly by a law enforcement officer, and it was streamed to the world. Now, in response, we also saw a few months later the shooting of Jacob Blake, again by a law enforcement officer. He was shot 7 times in the back. In response to the lynching of George Floyd, President Trump, who was our president at that time, stated he doesn't like chokeholds, but said they were still necessary, but proposed a ban on chokeholds within our law enforcement. At then that point, candidate Joe Biden proposed that we just retrain our officers to shoot people in the legs instead of in the chest. These were their solutions to the lynching of George Floyd. So what did that mean a few months later when Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by law enforcement officers? Well, obviously, President Trump's solution had no impact on that because he wasn't choked. And if you think back just a few months ago, right, just a few months ago, President Biden's Justice Department decided that they were not going to prosecute the Kenosha, Wisconsin police officer who shot Jacob Blake. Now, people were a little upset about this, but this was not surprising. Why? Because what happened to Jacob Blake was actually the preferred outcome of President Biden. Let's shoot them in the leg instead of in the heart. Let's just make this non-lethal. That was the solution. Obviously, it didn't solve the problem. Now I want to talk about Supreme Court case precedents. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court saw a case. It was Johnson versus McIntosh. This is 2 men of European descent. They were litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from the government. The other one got the same land from a native tribe, and they wanted to know who owned it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court has to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. They ruled the principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subject or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, and that title was consummated by possession. They then go on to reference the doctrine of discovery and state that even though natives were here first, but because we're savages, we only have what's called the right of occupancy to the land, while Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, the fee title to it, so therefore they are the true title holders. This case in 1823 helps create the legal precedent for land titles. Now, this precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, 1985, and most recently in 2005. The 2005 Supreme Court case, which happened in our lifetime, I actually have a TEDx talk going in depth into that Supreme Court case. It's called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in US history. And I demonstrate how this is probably one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court opinions written in my lifetime. And that opinion was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, this shocks people because wasn't she the voice of dissent on a very conservative leaning Supreme Court fighting for the rights of the marginalized? Yes, she was. But when it came down to land titles, and because land titles are based on the notion of natives are savages and white people are superior, this results in white supremacy becoming a bipartisan value. So the United States Supreme Court is a systemically racist and white supremacist court that to this day has legal precedent based on the understanding that natives and people of color are not fully human. Now, this plays out in our politics as well. In 2020, President Trump disestablished the Mashpee Wampanoag Reservation that had been established by the Obama-Biden administration a few years earlier. This was seen as unjust because A, it was revoking and taking back land that was promised to the Mashpee Wampanoag, but B, it happened at the beginning of a global pandemic. It was almost like kicking people out of their apartment right when they were going into a national tragedy. It was seen not only as unjust, but even as cruel. President Biden, candidate Biden, of course, had some words about this, and he admonished the Trump administration. He pointed to the fact that that reservation was established by the Obama-Biden administration. And then he went on to state what was going on. And he went on to say in his statement that one of the important roles the federal government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship is taking lands into trust on behalf of tribes. He said this is critical for tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Now, this statement probably doesn't shock you, and it's because you're used to Native Americans being dehumanized in our political rhetoric. But let's think about if he said this statement to another nation. What if he said one of the most important roles the federal government plays in rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship with French people is taking land into trust on behalf of France? This is critical for French sovereignty and self-determination. Well, that would be at best laughable and maybe an outright declaration of war. Imagine if Native peoples said this to the US government: one of the most important roles the tribes play in rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship with the American people is taking land into trust on behalf of the United States federal government. This is critical for US sovereignty and self-determination. The US would never stand for statements like that. That would be a declaration of war. But this is how we talk to Native peoples. You see, Native peoples aren't really sovereign over our lands. We're sovereign over our lands like your teenage child is sovereign over their bedroom. Our lands are actually held in trust for us by the federal government. This is due to the doctrine of discovery. Now, this played out in 2020 when there was a Supreme Court case, McGirt versus Oklahoma. It was a landmark case. It actually stated, it resulted in, it was seen as a victory for the Native nations. And it was seen as basically establishing most of Eastern Oklahoma as reservation lands. And it was actually a very important case for establishing, for judicial purposes, the fact that Oklahoma, the eastern half of Oklahoma, was in fact reservation land. However, if you read the entire opinion, you will see that the court actually stood on some very white supremacist precedents. They acknowledged that as far as the Trail of Tears was, there was a promise, and that the Georgia and Alabama and the Creek Nation received assurances of their new lands in the West would be secure forever, and that Congress had not taken back those lands. And so they were going to hold Congress to that promise, to that treaty. But they went on in their ruling in 2020 to state that to determine whether a tribe continues to hold a reservation, there's only one place we may look: the acts of Congress. And this court long ago held that the legislature wields significant constitutional authority when it comes to tribal relations, possessing even the authority to breach its own promises and treaties. So the Native nations were arguing that these lands were still reservations because the state and the courts did not have the authority to revoke the reservation promises. And they were correct. That's why they won the case. But the Supreme Court said anytime Congress wants to break those treaties or break those promises, they can do that with impunity, and nobody, even the court system, will hold them accountable. They said only Congress can divest a reservation of its land and diminish its boundaries. And so basically this Supreme Court case, it said while the Mashpee Wampanoag, or while the Creek Nation may have won this case, ultimately they have no authority because Congress can revoke those permissions anytime they please. I only have a few more minutes, so I want to go one more into our understanding of land covenant. And I want to talk about our understanding of manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny is the belief coming out of the early 19th century that the United States of America has the God-given right to rule this continent, Turtle Island, from sea to shining sea. This resulted in the completion of the Transcontinental Railway. This resulted in moving the nation all the way from the East Coast, all the way to the West Coast, to the Pacific Ocean. I want to go through the Western expansion, which happened in the 19th century. I want to talk about the Second Great Awakening, which there's this national revival, and there's this almost this religious fervor as our nation is moving further and further west. And then this declaration that our nation has a manifest destiny. Now, there are many ways I can talk about manifest destiny and how brutal and absolutely genocidal it was. But one of the best ways to help you understand our bipartisan values for this horrific historical act is through the actions of Abraham Lincoln. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed two bills, the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres to any individual willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act allocated the land and resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Within 4 years of signing that bill, after the hanging of the Dakota 38 and the removal of the Dakota and the Winnebago from Minnesota, after the Bear River Massacre in Utah and Idaho, after the Long Walk and the removal of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache from the territory of New Mexico and Arizona, and after the Sand Creek Massacre and the removal of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho from Colorado, Abraham Lincoln had literally been ethnically cleansing and creating space for manifest destiny. In fact, during his annual message in 1864, he stated that 1.5 million acres were entered in under the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific states by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. You see, if we look at what he was doing, this is a map of the initial routes of the Transcontinental Railway. There were 3 routes. The primary one going from Omaha, Nebraska, through Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and coming out near San Francisco, California. We have a northern route going from Duluth, Minnesota, through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and coming out near Seattle. And we have a southern route going through the territories of New Mexico, Arizona, and coming out near Los Angeles. Within 2.5 years of signing the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, after the removal of the Winnebago and the Dakota from Minnesota, after the Sand Creek Massacre and the removal of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho from Colorado, after the Long Walk and the removal of the Navajo, Mescalero Apache, and after the Bear River Massacre and the removal of the Shoshone from Idaho and Utah, Abraham Lincoln had literally ethnically cleansed the primary routes of the Transcontinental Railway, making him one of the most ethnic cleansing and genocidal presidents in American history. The 19th century was so bad, completing manifest destiny, that Peter Burnett, the governor of California, stated that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying that famine's broken out and we can't feed these people, nor is he saying that disease has broken out and we can't stop it. He's literally saying we can't stop killing these people until they're extinct and we complete our manifest destiny. So we have a lot of conversation, especially in Virginia right now, about honoring genocidal leaders like General Sherman Lee, right? Talking about removing statues and taking things down. But we have national monuments and statues all over our nation honoring Abraham Lincoln, even though he was one of the most genocidal and ethnic cleansing presidents in our nation's history. My book, Unsettling Truth, has 2 chapters deconstructing the mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln. One of the things that we have to do if we are really going to confront racism and white supremacy within our country is we have to deal with it at a foundational level. And as people of faith, we have to step above and beyond being protesters or lobbyists, and we have to learn how to speak truth to our leaders, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their political party, and regardless of what we think of all of their policies. We have to speak the truth because no one else is going to do it. There's a great quote by George Erasmus, who's an Aboriginal leader from Canada. And he used this quote when he was talking about the truth and the reconciliation commissions that was taking place in Canada. He said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If we want to build community, he said, we have to start by creating a common memory. I love that quote. I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially regarding race, which is we do not have a common memory. And if you look back over our history, there's actually no point in US history where we have healthy community across racial lines. We have to work to address these things, not by attacking a single political party, not by attacking one specific leader or another specific leader, but by addressing the foundations of our nation and the bipartisan political values that our country shares. The United States of America is not racist and sexist and white supremacist in spite of our foundations. We are white supremacists, racist, and sexist because of our foundations, and we must learn to address it at that level. This is my work, is to educate people on this history, to call for this type of understanding and learning, and not so that we can shame or embarrass or cause harm for people, but so that we can actually find ways to move forward as a nation in a very, very healthy way. I have great respect for your organization. I am grateful for your values to address racism and sexism and white supremacy and to advocate for healthy and good public policy. And I want to focus you on the values that we place at our foundations so that we can actually make the changes we need to, so that we can live in a nation where really, for the very first time, we the people might actually mean all the people.
Thank you so much. So like literally my cell phone is blowing up with people telling me how wonderful you are this morning. Class has been in session. Thank you for your heart, Mark Charles. I will say this for folks who are sending questions, we're going to form roundtables around several of the things that Mark Charles talked about today so we can have fuller discussion. Today really was sort of the intro to what our racial equity program will be focusing on this year, to give you all, as he said, sort of the focus. And so thank you so much, so very much. Absolutely beautiful.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. I'm going to just, before I leave, I'll put a few links into the chat for everyone to see so you can get some of the links I referenced during my talk, but it was an honor to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I echo Dora's sentiments exactly. I was truly moved. I took a lot of notes. I learned a lot. I'm looking forward to the roundtable, and I will definitely be reflecting on what more I can do to move faith communities in this work of truth and equity. I am Jessica Seiler, actually, previous Jessica Carter, and I am a VICPP Healthcare Hope Ambassador and VICPP's Henrico / Greater Richmond chapter leader. In my professional life, I am a healthcare operations manager. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Ronnie Jenkins. She is the March of Dimes Director of Health Equity Training. Ms. Jenkins has demonstrated experience transforming programs and organizations through her expertise in the fields of diversity, equity, and inclusion, change management, education, human resource development, and advocacy. With over a decade of experience, she is a thought leader in multiple sectors, such as public education, public health, nonprofit, local governments, multinational corporations, law firms, and more. Over the past year, Ronnie has trained and advised more than 30,000 professionals and provided diversity, equity, and inclusion education to global communities. Her work focuses on creating a more inclusive environment, a sense of belonging, and a culture of engagement and equity. At March of Dimes, Ms. Jenkins and team continue to work to further develop a strategic approach to bias training in maternal and infant health care, health equity education, and advocacy. Ms. Jenkins holds diversity, equity, and inclusion credentials from Cornell University and the Cultural Intelligence Center, and is currently a doctoral candidate in diversity and equity from the University of Illinois. I'm excited to hear what she has to say to help us understand the impact of the unconscious bias training we have on Virginia's healthcare professionals. Thank you so much, Ms. Ronnie. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. I am so happy to be here with you all this morning and be able to share some of what I do in the day-to-day, but then also the impacts of this work. And so within the field of maternal and infant health care, persons who are members of racial and ethnic minority groups experience disparities in access to care services, treatment and care settings, and health outcomes. And these differences cannot be explained entirely by the social drivers of health. So things like differences in income, housing, education alone. And an example of this is the Giving Voice to Mothers study that reports that equal treatment is not the case for patients of color. So 1 in 6 women reported experiencing one or more types of mistreatment, such as loss of autonomy, being shouted at, scolded, or threatened, or even being ignored, refused, or receiving no response to requests for help. So imagine seeing your care provider trying to gain assistance, but instead, that's not the case. And so while disparities which exist are truly multifactorial, research determined that one contributing factor to the disparities that exist is implicit bias. And so this is one of the #1 things that we really try to focus on here in March of Dimes, is because it's important to break down those barriers, because every individual deserves the best possible health outcomes they can receive. And so over the past 1.5 years, I've trained over 30,000 healthcare professionals in implicit bias training through the March of Dimes. And it's important, and I wanted to highlight that I was saying healthcare professionals, because it's not just about your care provider, but it's that front desk staff, it's the valet, any person that has an interaction with the patient can affect how their care is received, can affect their confidence and communication throughout a care setting. And it's important for us to really highlight this. And so through my trainings, one of the things that I absolutely love is the vulnerability and the transparency. And I have to admit, I'm truly biased towards these live interactions because every perspective counts. It is so important for us to bring various stories to the table, because what might not be your walk of life could be someone else's. And so we really do need to gain this holistic understanding of the importance of our biases. And so I want to start just really quick by debunking misconceptions, because the reality is all of us are biased. Some are positive biases and some are negative. And these could be towards any individual that we interact with. And so through these trainings with healthcare professionals, what we found is that 100% of our professionals have and reported an intent to change behavior because they saw value in this education, because it's not just about bias towards patients, but also how do you mitigate that? We need to take it from awareness that we've been getting, especially since the murder of George Floyd, to action. So what are those tangible things that we can do in our day-to-day? What are those strategies? How can we alter our verbiage to ensure that we are communicating effectively and ensuring the best possible outcomes for every individual? And so that's something that we really try to target and highlight, because the reality is this impact is tremendous. And so when we do these trainings, you know, we've had a longitudinal study with this training through multiple sites in Ohio, and our professionals are reporting back saying, you know, we remembered some strategies, some things really stuck with us that we were determined to move forward. We were determined to adjust, because the reality is healthcare professionals also had to understand, okay, if my patient is biased towards me, how do I respond to ensure that this interaction is still positive, so that this interaction is still trying to enhance what we're doing, not breaking it down. And so I have to refer back to what Mark was stating, because the reality is implicit bias training is not about the blame game. It's not about breaking people down. It's about, hey, here are strategies to enhance what we are doing. Here are strategies to take action to improve better outcomes, because we have to consider that pregnancy-related death has more than doubled over the past 30 years, and the US is the most dangerous developed nation to give birth in. How scary is that? And so we really have to consider all these different factors that come to play. And one of those, as reported, is implicit bias. And so I will say that, through the trainings and through the interactions, I've had a number of healthcare professionals just open up and say, I thought I was doing the right thing. I did not think that I had an issue with implicit bias. And the key thing to understand is that implicit is the key term there. It's unconscious. You don't realize that it's occurring until you learn strategies to start acknowledging it, to start becoming aware of it. And so one example is so many healthcare providers, they have the best intentions and they say, I do my best to treat all patients the same, right? They want to have the best for every patient, but the verbiage that's utilized is, I treat all patients the same. And the reality is that's speaking to equality. That's not speaking to the individual needs that each patient requires. And so one of the even quick tips that I give during training is that let's pivot language. Let's be more inclusive. Let's speak to what we are truly trying to portray through actions. And instead of saying, I treat all my patients the same, say, I do my best to meet the needs of every patient to produce better outcomes. That is speaking to equity. That is speaking to building that culture of equitable care. But it's important for us to realize that implicit bias training is not a one and done. One training is not going to completely change an entire organization. The focus of implicit bias training is on that individual component, because if we don't realize how to mitigate things within ourselves, how can we contribute to the bigger picture? And so that's one of the most important things when we do this implicit bias training, is that on an individual level, we need to learn how to become aware. We need to learn how to be able to mitigate and pursue action. And what happens is that collectively, as we do this on an individual level, these equity champions come together to produce change, to speak in numbers, to apply action in numbers. And that's why implicit bias training is so important and so valuable, because it really takes the individual from awareness to action, which contributes to the large picture that we see in our day-to-day care settings. And so I'm going to pause there and I'll see, Dora, do you have any questions before I have?
Oh, we about to run into some action right now with that foundation. So amazing, amazing, amazing. So if anything you got from today's plenary before we go into our action is that we're in the truth telling business here this morning, like amazingly. So thank you, Ronnie. I want to give some background. So everything that Ronnie just shared is sort of the root of our maternal health campaign. The alarm that rang 2 years ago with the soaring maternal mortality for Black women caused a lot of states to go into action. And so of all the states that had increasing numbers, California was the only one that had their numbers of the number of women dying in pregnancy-related deaths decrease. So all eyes turned to California to see what they did. And so they did a complete overhaul of all of their clinical interventions from A to Z of the process in a healthcare setting. And even though the number of women still decreased, the disparity percentage, Black women still were dying 3 to 4 times more than their counterparts. And so that then let all healthcare experts and all healthcare professionals know there's a solution here that's not based in the medical field. And it's not linked to a woman's race. It is linked to racism, because that disparity did not care about the woman's income, her education, or her insurance plan. So California then began to implement a requirement for implicit bias training. And it was not until they did that training that the disparities began to reduce. So here in Virginia, we picked that up here at the center, and I drafted a bill around it. Virginia's maternal mortality review team in 2019 found more deaths, pregnancy-related deaths, the majority of pregnancy-associated deaths were attributed to provider-related factors, all of which Ronnie ran through when she began. However, in their recommendations in their report, it did not include what California did. So again, I said, yes, we are definitely picking up implicit bias training as a priority for our Push Maternal Health campaign. quick note, even though it emerges out of our maternal mortality work, all health sectors experience the negative outcomes due to implicit bias. I have a quote from the National Cancer Institute, said implicit bias is the most insidious and least recognizable mechanism from which that causes disparities and inequities. So to add on to what Ronnie was saying about it being unconscious, Virginia's Board of Medicine, we've been engaging since last spring around this. They do support the training. However, the board, when we gave testimony in June, they really settled on the fact that it should just be voluntary. So even though we've been working with their executive director to provide resources that other states have vetted, they're of the mind that we shouldn't mandate it, shouldn't be a requirement. And so we are not in agreement with that based on everything that Ronnie said. The fact that it's unconscious, people will not automatically say, yes, I need this training. So we're making it in our bill a criterion to receive a new or renewed license from the Virginia Board of Medicine. There's 2 patrons that we have. Delegate Dolores McQuinn is carrying it in the House, and Senator Mamie Locke is carrying it in the Senate. I thank their staff, amazing staff we're working with. The language would say, and it follows the same mandate for continuing education that was done during the opioid crisis in 2016. It requires 2 hours of training every biennium, which is the cycle for license renewal here in Virginia. We are working on co-patrons. In the Senate, Senator Hashmi and Senator Barker have agreed to be chief co-patrons. And clearly we all know that in the House, it must be bipartisan in order to live. And I can very happily say that Delegate Chris Head is so supportive. He hasn't come on full board yet as a chief co-patron, but we met with him in December, and I've been in communication with his staff in his office ever since. And they left me a message yesterday because I've been sort of reminding them, has he decided to become a chief co-patron? When we met with him in December, he was well aware of the facts, well aware of the situation. I put a link in the chat of a podcast that he said he had listened to that shocked him at the realities that Ronnie discussed. It's called the With Good Reason. It's a podcast done by Virginia Humanities. So he knew the situation, he knew the issues, and he said, yes, we have to do something about it. And I got that same commitment times 100 yesterday from his LA. He said, yes, we talked about it this morning. And I was so shocked. I was like, without me prompting you, like you all had your own conversation about, so that was very promising. And he said, yes, we're going to move it out of committee. And then, we have time to work out, being co-patron, however you want to support it, but we will discuss it with Delegate McQuinn. He gave me that commitment. And so my heart was eased. I was like, yes, he is truly, truly committed to supporting this bill and making sure that it moves through the House with bipartisan support. And so I thank him and his staff for that. We do have a growing coalition behind it. So definitely public voices, that's what we're here. We're advocates. In a minute, I'm gonna get to what you can do today. I will say this, just in the past couple of weeks, we had some major support coming for the coalition with organizations that are gonna be pushing this and lobbying legislators. Virginia Now, the National Women's Political Caucus of Virginia, the Virginia Public Health Association, their board met about the bill last Friday. So I'm waiting to hear back from the president, although she supports it, and she informed me that the chairs of their Health Equity Committee supports it. And then the Deltas, they have their Delta Day, which I told them, I said, your Delta Day of advocacy is January 24th, this coming Monday. I said, that is National Maternal Health Awareness Week, where we are planning a day of action. So we are going to coordinate and they're going to support that effort. So very, very excited. You will be hearing more about this stuff. So we're lining up testimony for when it becomes before committee. But here's something that I want you all to do today to take action. So we have a petition that will go to your senator or legislator. I'm going to drop the link in a minute in the chat, and it will go up on the slide as well so that you can have it. And so, there's a message that's already crafted. You can adapt it. If you've used our petition system before, Your legislators will automatically appear at the bottom of the screen. If not, when you put in your address, our system will then navigate it to the appropriate districts for you based on your address, and it will send your name and your message to your legislator. So give me 1 minute, and I'm so very, very excited. So the URL is about to go in, so you can just click on it, and then I'll put the slide up so folks can. Yes, I will. And it does appear in the, did I type it right? Push bias out. That's our slogan, push bias out. Yes. So the House bill is 1105. The Senate bill is 456. So, and I tried that petition after our system crashed yesterday, but everyone, I'm going to give you all a few minutes while I play my theme song for my campaign. And oh, there's an ad now, so I might have to wait a bit. Hold up. Okay. I'm more than the color of my skin. I'm a girl that likes to sing. All I know is what's within. Not just a brown girl in the ring. Go to school to learn their ways. Told how to think and what to say. While my mother says to pray, I pray for better days. God, please help them see they ain't no different from me. Not above, not beneath. Teach them equality. I'm not just a brown girl in the rain. I'm a girl that likes to sing. I'm not just a brown girl in the rain. I'm a girl that likes to sing. I'm more than what they think of me, more than the color tone that they see, more than urban R&B, more than a slang that I speak. Close your eyes, don't say a word, don't speak about what you see, no hurt. Let's pretend that it's okay, just the way the devil likes. Look in my eyes, look in my eyes. I can't lie, I can't lie. All these years of my life, just from the outside. I'm not just a brown girl in the rain. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time out. The links will stay there. So feel free.
Steve Austin and Matty Ice.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Karen to close us out. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Dora. Thank you all for attending this day, the second day of our Days for All People Advocacy Week. I know there was a little bit of an issue with sending out emails, and I'm sure that we'll work on that through the course of the morning, but please continue to give it a try. Thank you, Dora, for our guidance on that. Starting at 10 o'clock this morning, we have 3 workshops, one on solitary confinement, which will have Spanish interpretation, one on equitable transportation, and one on working with the ICPP's Faith Influencers Liaison Program. This afternoon at 1:30, we will offer 3 more workshops, one on farm worker justice with Spanish interpretation, one on health equity, and a third on utility disconnections. And then finally at 3, we will offer 2 more workshops, one on Advocacy 101 with Spanish interpretation, and one on affordable housing solutions. I hope you signed up for these. If not, you can still do so. And I'm hoping, Dora, you'll put that in the chat at tinyurl.com/2022 DFAP sessions. And again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow at tomorrow's plenary.